All right, we're gonna go ahead and get started. So normally Nawel would be here to introduce this, but he is at San Diego Comic-Con. So I am here to introduce this panel, which is gonna be excellent. So I don't really have any announcements other than to say that if you've missed any of our episodes, you can go to the Negative Space podcast on any major podcasting platform or the Negative Space YouTube channel. And if you want to sign up for the live events, you can go to negativespacecomics.com/events and you can see what we have coming up. We've got the August events filling in, so you'll be able to sign up for those soon. But let's get into the conversation today. So today we're talking with Deb JJ Lee, who you will see here on screen with me. Deb is a Korean-American artist currently living in Brooklyn, New York. They have appeared in The New Yorker, Washington Post, NPR, Google, Radiolab, PBS, and more. Books they've illustrated include The Invisible Boy by Alyssa Hollingsworth and The Other Side of Tomorrow by Tina Cho. They enjoy reality TV, sparkling water, and pretending to be an extrovert. Deb,
It's
welcome.
true. It's true. It's still true. Hi. Thanks for having me.
Of
Um,
course. Thanks for being
yeah,
here.
of
So
course.
we're going to start where we always do, which is with your creative origin story. What made you want to tell stories in the first place?
I fell into it by accident, actually. I feel like what is life but a pleasant oopsie? I just kind of stumbled into it. Um, I actually have a background. I mean, if we're going into the whole like my villain origin story, my I went to school in a very engineering focused university, and I was basically training to become a UX designer in Silicon Valley. Like that's kind of the program that they had us do. So I didn't really draw for a while, and I think there was a point where I I realized that drawing is actually very important to my mental psyche. So then I started drawing again after realizing that like, UX design isn't really for me, but I was still in it professionally. And I think it was my senior year of college where I decided that, illustration is the thing that I want to do, and I was in a very lucky spot because I had a full-time job lined up after graduation at LinkedIn actually. And I was also, just in a spot where I can like goof around, but like goof off and while still making sure that I get all my assignments done and on time. But I was, trying to make a portfolio at the same time. So was I was just like doing as much. I was just desperate to build an illustration portfolio. And there were a few lucky breaks. By the time I had a full illustration portfolio, I think it was like spring semester, like every week I would make something and slap it in on my website. And then it would just grow and grow and grow. And by spring semester, I had like a pretty healthy like amount of work. And I applied to a few things. Like I applied for the Society of Illustrators, which is like they have the student competition every year, and I got in. And like to my surprise, like I did pretty well. Like one of my pieces ended up getting like a pretty good scholarship, which was surprising because I knew I was competing against like kids from RISD, kids from SVA, who like they've been submitting that school have been has been submitting work into the Society of Illustrators for like decades. And when I was like um submitting to the Society of Illustrators, it turns out I had to register the school because no one has ever submitted anything to the Society of Illustrators. So it was surprised that like the first time that my school submitted something, like it did really well. So that was actually how my literary agent found me because they posted about it on Twitter, and my agent found me through like a tweet, as we all do nowadays. And then he reached out and was like, "Hey, have you ever thought about working in picture books?" And I said, like I was actually trying to go for. I mean, I didn't tell him this at the time, but I wanted to do more editorial illustration,
Mm,
which like there's a lot of glory in editorial illustration, even though it's like the least. It's like the bottom of the bucket for illustration, though, because it's like everyone is trying to fight for pennies, and it's so underpaid. But I was like, I know I want to be an editorial illustrator, but like, sure. At that point, I was like willing to take anything.
Mm.
So got a literary agent, and by the time um, and then I actually got there was like an NPR illustration internship that comes out once in a blue moon, and I happened to be the one to get it, even though I was like competing against like kids who come from illustration backgrounds. Like I was like, I'm kind of figuring my stuff out like for 3 months, and I was able to get all these things that like, made me, it was a lot of like external validation that like, oh no,
Hmm.
you are just as qualified as these like art kids. Um, Even though you're kind of like faking it until you make it really. And then I worked at NPR, and then later that fall I moved to the Bay Area to start working at LinkedIn, UX designer, but what they really had me do was like make illustration, which what does that mean? I don't know. I still don't know what my job was actually. And then by the time it was like around the fall, and then when I was there, and I kind of like was noticing the cultural differences of like the demographics are really different from where I grew up versus Sunnyvale, which is where I lived in Silicon Valley. And it was just like there were a lot of Korean families, and I felt like this was my first time being around Korean families where I didn't really have an in, because usually it's my parents who are like, "Oh, hey, like this is Deb, like they are Korean too," and you're like kind of welcomed in with open arms. But as a non-Korean speaker, like I can't speak Korean, or I can't do it well. I have like the vocabulary of like a 3-year-old maybe. And so I felt a little bit of angst. And then um I like wrote a little comic about it. And this was like my second comic ever, like maybe like 4 pages. And I was like, oh, this is so much work. This is so hard. And then it took me like a week. I like really hauled ass to do it. And it took me like a weekend. And I posted on Twitter, and it actually went viral because,
Mm.
but for me, it went viral because I didn't really have like a following at the time. So it went pretty viral for my standards. And I think it was because Michelle Zauner from Crying in H Mart, Japanese Breakfast retweeted it. And I didn't know her at the time. I only know like some of her music. Um, but this was before Crying in H Mart was announced. And now when you read Crying in H Mart, you're like, oh, like it makes sense why she would post this. And then my agent was like, oh, I didn't know you make comics. And to be honest, I didn't either. So, he was like, he threw in another idea. It's like, how about you make a graphic novel? Like, would you want to pause like the idea of pitching a picture book aside and start working on a graphic novel instead? And I said, okay, sure. Um, I mean, I had no idea what I was doing because like I said, like I've only made like maybe 1.5 comics. So we put together a pitch packet and we submitted it. And I think like it was crazy. I think like in 30 minutes, my current editor reached out and was like, yeah, like I want this. And we got like a multi-book deal out of that. And so
Wow.
I really just tripped into it. There were no plans when I started illustration to work in comics. Like I haven't really read a lot of I I didn't really grow up with comics.
Mhm.
Like comics weren't a big part of my life at all. Mostly because my mom wouldn't let me read them like outside of like, the library or like the bookstore, like we weren't allowed to take them home.
Mhm.
Um I guess aside from Calvin and Hobbes, but like that was like a little treat. Um but yeah, I really just tripped into it. I wish I had a better answer of like like how to make it in graphic novels. Like I don't know. Like I didn't really. I'm lucky that I didn't have to struggle to find an agent or find an editor because they kind of just like fell into my lap
Mhm.
in a way. And I think it was just like being there at the right time at the right place and having like a portfolio at the ready just in case if any opportunity wants to find you.
I,
Does that make sense?
yeah, and I like that answer because one of the things that we see through all the people we talk to here is that there is no right way to get into this. There is no like you follow these steps and you're there. Sometimes it just happens. And
Hmm.
I think there are a lot of things I wanted to get back to, but first off, I wonder if you could explain what maybe a stupid question. What is editorial illustration?
Sure. Editorial illustration would be like illustrations for like one-off illustrations for articles, like
Okay.
magazines or newspapers. Like when you open the New York Times, there's probably like an illustration on the front page. That's an editorial illustration.
Hmm.
The New Yorker is considered, like any drawings in the New Yorker, excluding the cartoons, are considered editorial illustrations. I think editorial illustrations are meant to convey like one story, like one short article or one short think piece or something.
Hmm.
Um, yeah.
And then I wanted to ask, you mentioned how you were up against all these kids who were coming from these really prestigious art schools. And I wanted to
Yeah.
ask about how you were figuring out your artistic style during this time. Like, were you going to classes for this, or what were sort of your creative inspirations that were helping you compete with this sort of higher education of art?
I mean, I found out that my university doesn't support illustration at all. I think like the most illustration resources I had were like maybe like this much of shelf space in like an arm's length of shelf space in the library about like illustration for the entire university. And a professor who used to be an illustrator but quit, and I think out of bitterness, like told me all these lies about the illustration industry and told me that, like, why would you charge any money for a picture book if no one's going to hire you? Like verbatim, like she's like, no one's going to hire you, Deb. Like stuff like that. So I was like actively being discouraged to pursue illustration, and I really relied on, cold emailing. I relied on listening to podcasts, like listening to stuff like this. I
Mhm.
think is how I would have like tried to teach myself what the illustration industry looks like. Um, I don't actually, Instagram is a big help because you kind of figure out like, well, who's following who, and you kind of figure out like what the network of illustration looks like. Especially, I guess, New York illustrators tend to be very like, they have like their own groups, I would say.
That's funny because whenever I was in undergrad, I had a creative writing professor, and I was so into writing, and I just found it, and I was like, how can I get a book out there? And he's like, you can't, you won't.
Oh,
I'm like, oh, well, that's fun. So I like to
what?
hear
Like, why? Why did he
that.
say that?
I think it was the same thing. It's just a teacher, a frustrated teacher who's, you know, not, it wasn't an English school. Like, it wasn't a school that you go to for creative writing.
I
It was
see.
similar where I went there for something completely different and realized that creative writing was so much more fun. And this was, I guess, the best that they had was somebody to sort of teach you the art and then tell you you can't ever do anything with this, which was
That's kind
quite the
of, yeah, they
experience.
shouldn't let those people teach because
Mm-mm.
it's like you're here, you could be at somewhere else, and you're clearly frustrated and you've given up a little bit, but you can't lash out to students
Right.
who who have a shot,
Hmm.
probably.
Yeah. Anyway, so I wanted to ask you also about sort of creative breakthrough moments that you've had, especially being, you know, not entirely self-taught, but somebody who's been exploring your style. Like, what were there any moments in your either professional or creative life where you had like aha epiphany moments of understanding yourself as an artist better?
Um, yeah, there were a few moments. I think when I was trying to become an editorial illustrator, I noticed that a lot of those people tend to try to find a voice through like really unconventional ways. So maybe that's not the right way to say it, but they tend to have work that is a little bit more experimental.
Mm.
Editorial art directors tend to, they like to like break the mold of what illustration is. So you see a lot of like wacky illustrations that are really popular among editorial illustration, but like, doesn't really fly with like isn't as common as you would see in like publishing. Like it's not as digestible, etc.
Mhm.
So I was really pushing myself to see like, well, what can I be? And I think I tried to become somebody that I really wasn't that way. So I started drawing in ways where, I realized that like time really told, like it was really like it was like um it was time that would tell me that, oh no, like this is not how you like to draw. Like this is not the type of drawing that makes you happy. Like these are drawings that you can appreciate like on Pinterest, but it's not something that would make you happy in the long term.
Mhm.
Um, so that's one of those moments where I realized that okay, I'm experimenting for the sake of experimenting and not because I'm trying to evolve like to a different version of myself. Um, and yeah, I don't think I really realized like what my like illustration style was. Like I don't think I really figured out that path until like maybe beginning of last year.
Mm.
So I've only been drawing in the way that I've drawn since like beginning of 2022 when I started mixing. I just like decided that, you know, I don't have to work. There are no rules in illustration. Like just because I have a lot of line work doesn't mean I can only use line work in an illustration. Like I can really paint in it as well. And I think that really like I don't have to follow rules. And I think that's why my illustrations look really rigid at first. Like in my opinion, I think they look pretty rigid. Um, and then I figured out like, oh no, like I can mix like painting and line work because those are both things I like to do. So I think it was then when I realized that, oh, this is the kinds of illustration that I like doing. And luckily for me, I think that is when more work started coming in. Like I think people realize that, oh, these look good. And then I started getting reached out to by like illustration agents, and more brands that wanted to work with me. And then that's when like I started getting work a little bit more regularly, knock on wood.
Mhm.
Hope that continues. But you never know with freelance. Like you can have some dry months, dry years, even. You just never know.
I want to get back to something you'd mentioned about how you shared this first cartoon, and that's what got a lot of attention. Especially
Hmm.
because a lot of, that's something that a lot of artists hear is you have to put stuff out there in the world. But it can be daunting
Yeah.
at times. So
Oh, yeah.
how did you sort of come to terms with sharing your stuff and find the confidence to put it out there?
Um, I don't think I ever struggled with the confidence because I've been posting art online since like I was 13 or 14. So it was just like something that I've always been used to. Um, I think it helped that in my high school and my like my grade, like I was known as like the drawing kid, like I was known as the art kid. So um I was like, yeah, like I had certain pride in my work and I like drawing during school. Like I like to like not pay attention during class. And as a result have no idea what's going on. Um and I had confidence like no, like I know my drawings are good. And then like for like the type of experience or like my age at the time. So I was like fine posting it to like DeviantArt or to Tumblr, but you know, like it took a while. I don't think it was until like maybe like a couple years ago when my work started becoming like, oh, like people start recognizing my work or like people like sometimes I don't have to introduce myself. And that that's a crazy moment to think about like after almost 10 years of posting art online. I think it's just like I think if anything I have a problem with like posting stuff online or like or like thinking that like this is something I talk to with my therapist all the time, but like I feel like, oh, well, if it doesn't do well online, then it must not be good, right? Like but that's just not true. I'm trying to like, you know, I am drawing a little bit more to like stuff that's for me. You know, I like started working well, it's like back there and I'm not like it's actually holding a page, so I don't want to like ruin that. But I've been filling up a sketchbook today or like the last few months where it's just me practicing drawing figures. And it's stuff that I'm not going to share to anybody because it's just like scribbles. But being comfortable with, you know, not every drawing you do has to be shareable, you know, like be okay with being messy and have some things that you kind of keep closer to your heart. Um, so yeah, I think it's just like I have the opposite problem
Mhm.
where I try to like capitalize on everything I do. Um, when I shouldn't do that.
So let's get into In Limbo a bit. We might have to,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's right here, as you can see, In Limbo. It's a gorgeous graphic memoir. It's out now from First Second. So one thing that, there's a lot we're going to talk about here, but I want to first talk about why this was the period of life you want to focus on. Because memoir, you can choose, you choose which story you tell, which
Mhm.
part of your life you want to show. What was it about this part that you wanted to focus on?
I think it was, I don't know, I feel like my life has just been a giant like since I was as long as I can remember, I don't think I had a very particularly enjoyable childhood.
Mhm.
Um, but I think when it got really dark was in like closer between like 8th grade to high school.
Mm.
So it was just like, I think I had like the most material to talk about. I could like, always sprinkle in stuff from like the past that kind of informed the plot or informed my decision making. But yeah, I think it's just because like the high school times were like they really informed the kind of person I am now
Mm.
in a way. Like, even though I feel like I didn't really learn all the lessons that I should have learned at the time until like, I don't know, when I was like 21. But um yeah, I think it was just like if I tried to cover more, it would have been like a giant, like it would have been like a mammoth of a book.
Mhm.
And it's already kind of big, and I don't want to like, I don't want to bore anybody instead of like, I don't know. I think just putting it to high school makes sense because that's when our identities feel like they're like the shakiest, right? We don't really know who we are. We're about to like become like independent. We're about to go to college. We're about to like, and we have a lot of expectations about what high school is like, right?
Mhm.
Um, so I think that's a good question. I never really thought about this, but I feel like it's due to the fact that high school and middle school actually were like the darkest times of like my emotional life.
Sure.
That makes sense.
That makes total sense. And then similar to that, I'm curious, like, and I love hearing this from memoirs of all stripes of whenever you set out to tell this story, what was your objective? What were you hoping to achieve by telling this story?
I think it was mostly for me. I think I that's interesting. I At the beginning I realized that there was a point where I realized that, oh, am I making this book to call out other people who I felt like
Mm.
have wronged me? Am I pointing fingers? Is that why I'm making the book? And I realized that that's that's not a healthy way to, spend like so much of your life like being angry, or
Right.
spend so much of the time that you're spending working on this book being angry. Um, and then towards the because there were a lot more like microaggressions of the same like color, or this like the same conversations over and over and over again, but by like different people. So I realized that I had to like condense them all into like, one microaggression that was done over like a series of by a bunch of different people that I just like condensed into like one thing. And like I think halfway through I realized like, oh, this book is like not hateful, but I feel like people from my childhood, people from high school are gonna pick this up, and if they read it and they're like, oh wow, like Deb really hated us, but
Mm.
like Deb did like they were just there, like they didn't do anything wrong, like no one hated Deb, and that was true. Um I think there was I was putting a lot of resentment into places that didn't really deserve resentment. So halfway through, I kind of changed it. I had to change the plot. I had to change like the outcomes of everyone's actions and kind of throw it back on me to just tell people that like, yeah, I mean there were some people that were like kind of shitty, but that's not like their fault.
Mm.
Or like it is their fault, but like I could deal with this differently. And it became more about like, okay, like let's not like throw people under the bus, but let's make it so that I'm doing this for me.
Mm.
Like I know that if I die without making a book like this, that's about like me coming to terms with everything, I would be pretty unhappy,
Mm.
in general. So I'm really glad that I had the opportunity because I think I wanted to make some kind of like archive of like stuff that happened in my life. Since I remember thinking about this when I was like 10.
Mm.
I was like, I want to do something like this one day, even though I only had like 10 years of my life to talk about. But at like 10 years old, a lot had happened already. Um, that I was like, yeah, there's enough material here, but I had to wait a little bit longer to really have like the opportunity to, you know, tell stories like this.
And was there a moment, like you mentioned in the book that you've worked on this from since 2018, I believe.
Yeah.
Um, was there a moment when this story was in your head, where like, or even before the story, like when the story dawned on you that you realized you had to share this story? Was there like a inciting incident, so to say, where you're like, oh my gosh, this is the story I should tell?
Um, well, it was like that comic when I was at like this cafe and there was like Korean family and they were all like happy, and I for some reason felt the urge to like, you know, the strange urge to be like, hey, I'm Korean too, by the way, and like just in case you guys can't tell. Um, and that was the moment where I made the comic, where I wanted to make the comic, and then that's when it got picked up as like, oh, this can be a graphic novel. And at first, like my agent was like talking about the idea like, oh, what if you like make a graphic novel about you, about like an extension of this comic, which the comic was about like transgenerational like language barriers,
Mhm.
um like a way of like venting about how, you know, my grandparents will basically die without us having like a true conversation. um and he was like, why don't you just make a comic about like make a graphic novel about all those phone calls you do with your grandparents? And I was like, I am not going to do that because I don't have enough material. And if I'm going to talk about that, I have to talk about so much more. Like, oh, you want like a little box of this. Well, here's like closets and closets of all this emotional baggage that I can bring to the table. And like it's like this box is like attached to like the doorknob, which if I bring it out, everything's going to spill out from the closets that are behind me. So it's like you can't have that without this.
Mm. And then,
Yeah.
thinking back to high school, I think about high school sometimes, and there are things that stand out, but there are so many gaps between those things. So I'm curious how you went about sort of mining those memories and filling in the blanks, and how particular you were with the details of what happened day to day.
Yeah, I mean, most of them are like a lot of the stories or like the more generic moments in the book where it's like, oh, like going to the movies, oh, like we're in art class, like, oh, we're in English class now. Like those are all like generic enough that I can just like make my own. And
Mhm.
you know, like this could have happened in an alternate reality, but this isn't exactly how it played out. But it leaves you with the same emotion that I want you to have, like as I felt. So a generic interaction like probably never happened. Like the one of the some of the interactions in the book probably never happened, but like it's an amalgam of all these interactions that happen, like summed up in one conversation
Mhm.
that didn't actually happen the way it did. Um, Also, this is a little strange, but my English teacher, I have a lot of thoughts about this. My English teacher actually had us write journals as assignments. So I was able to, like in the most like pivotal, the darkest moments, I wrote them down like right after the fact into like into a Google Doc that I had to turn in for an assignment. So actually like the Google Doc was still there. So I
Hmm.
was able to like pick that up and be like, okay, like this is how it exactly played out. And I was able to like map it um like as like as it did when it happened almost 10 years ago. So thank you to my English teacher who was a strange man for having us write journal entries that he would then read and grade. I have a lot of stories about him actually. He was a this is like tangent. I know you said I remember you said that I can do tangents,
Yes.
but he was actually. Are you familiar with the Watch Your House? It was like a Netflix series, but it
Yes.
was based off of true story. Have you seen it?
Yes.
Do you remember the there was one episode where it was about an English teacher
Yeah.
that was based off of that English teacher, my English teacher.
Oh my.
He was the suspect, one of the suspects of the Watch Your House, and he was like in real life like my English teacher who made us write those journals. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Yep.
That's wild. Yeah, whenever you said
Yeah.
journal entries, I'm like, oh well, journal entries are cool. But then you were like, oh, he read and graded them. That's wild. That's
Because like he's a
something.
writer, he's a YA author, so he actually like it's pretty clear that I mean he was teaching in that school system since the 80s, and it was pretty clear that he would take our journal entries and like use them as inspiration for his own books, which became movies with Zac Efron and Richard
Hmm.
Linklater, who directed Boyhood, that won an Oscar. he also had his own NPR segment for a while, I think, in the 90s. And yeah, he's just a strange man. He was like a cool teacher, but then you look back 10 years later and you're like, oh, that was bad. Like that was
Mm.
bad. Um, yeah, anyway, that was my tangent. It's my
Wow.
little like fun facts that yeah, I know some of the Watcher House suspects like in real life.
That's crazy.
I'm convinced that he was it though.
Well, I'm convinced now too after what you just told me.
Yeah, he's a weird dude. Yeah.
So speaking of real people, I think that's one of the things that a lot of nonfiction writers struggle with is how you write about real people, how you navigate,
Mhm.
especially when they're close to you, when they're family, friends, loved ones. How did you navigate that space?
I mean, it's really just about being as transparent as possible, like letting the people know in your life that like, hey, I'm doing this and I if you want, I can change your identity a little bit. But this is happening. But like I think the person I was most concerned with was like probably my mom.
Mhm.
And I gave her many opportunities to be like, here's the draft, here's the second draft, here's how this is gonna go. Here's everything that happened that will be in the book. And she's like, okay, yeah, cool, like fine. I think she's accepted that, it's my life and I should be able to write what happened because, it affected me very much. She has not read the book and I don't expect her to. So but everybody else, like Kate, Quinn was a little bit more complicated, but like I made sure that I tried to minimize as many like one-to-one as possible. Like I made
Mhm.
up characters that were just like generic versions of like a bunch of people. So I was actually talking to some people from high school recently and they were asking like, well, who was who? And I said like, well, a group of people was this person and like another group of people was this person. So you can't really be like I think that's blank, but it's like, no, it was somebody, like it's a bunch of people. You won't be able to like really point them out.
Mhm. I know a lot of people who enter the nonfiction space end up writing it as fiction just to sort of avoid that. Did you ever consider
Hmm.
doing that, or was it always going to be nonfiction?
I think it was always going to be nonfiction.
Hmm. So you had gotten into a bit of storytelling elements, but I want to talk, especially because I feel like in the memoir space, I'm always curious how writers engage with the traditional storytelling elements, like character development, for instance. Were
Hmm.
you like concerned with building characters the way that you would in a traditional story, or were you just sort of telling it as you remembered it?
I was telling you as I remembered it. This is like my first full length story.
Mhm.
So I don't really know what to do next. Like I think I have to take like I think like later this year I'm gonna take some creative writing classes to really understand what that is because I don't really know what good writing is, to be
Mhm.
honest. Like I don't really like I can probably tell, but I don't know what it really like what the rules are, if there are any. Um yeah, so it's just a giant question mark because I know I have to make like stories later as part of my contract that are probably going to be fiction. And I have to figure out how to do that at all.
So this is also a storytelling element question, but I feel like I have specific examples from your book that I think will help as
Oh,
well. Of you know,
okay.
the pacing of it, I feel like was really really well. It felt like you intuitively knew when to do jump ahead, like skip ahead in time, and we went
Yeah.
from this point to now we're in another year of school. Was this part of the editing process, or were you just sort of intuitively knowing like, okay, we can skip ahead now because nothing else happened in this period?
Yeah, that was the editing process because at first the book was like almost twice, like it was like
Mhm.
50% longer than it was. Like it was basically 500 pages when I first wrote it out. But it got to the point where like, hey, we don't really need all this material. Like we can like scrap this. So there was a lot of scrapping. Which is I think a better problem to have than like here is very little work and we need to expand this. So I think yeah, like I really didn't know what to expect with that process, but I'm glad I had more than I should as opposed to not having enough.
Sure.
Um, so yeah, there was a lot of cutting from uh during the editing process.
And I will get
Yeah,
back to the editorial process when we talk about
sure.
the business side of things, but I also just want to touch on again how you were working at this project for a long time, and I know speaking from experience, speaking from a lot of writers I've talked to, they have trouble sticking with projects for that long, or they'll bounce around between projects. How did you stick
Yeah.
with this one for so long?
Well, it was like circumstantial, I think. Like when I quit my full-time job, like the pandemic started like a few months later. So I had enough money saved up from my time in Silicon and like in tech to be able to like, okay, well, if I don't get any work for a year, I'm solid. Like this is fine. But luckily that didn't happen. But it was my day job. Like that book was my day job. And I think I would say that I have a pretty strong work ethic. So I was able to schedule out like, okay, do 1 page a day, like when I was drawing it.
Mm.
But when I was editing it or when I was thumbnailing it, it was like a little like side project thing because I still had a job. Like that was something I had to work on in the off hours. But then when I was working on the book, like drawing it out, like rendering the pages that are what they are today, um, that was like, okay, draw 1 page a day. That was usually 8 hours a day. Like render this page once a day, and maybe have like 4 to 5 pages by the end of the week. And then that was drawn out to like, okay, well now I have like this long-term project that for some reason they're like having me do this, and I can't afford to not work on the book right now. So then I mean the book was supposed to come out in 2021 as it was originally slated, but that was just not humanly possible for me.
Mm.
So we actually got it extended to like 2023. And then I think that's my track record actually, is like each book will take me around 5 years,
Mhm.
more or less. And I think like that was a healthy, even that I felt like that's going fast. But um yeah, it was a process.
Mm.
I usually dedicate half my week to working on books and the other half of the week I'm working on other illustration projects right now. Yeah.
I wonder if you could go into more of the process, because I know it sounds like you have a really good creative practice in place. And I know there are a lot of writers who come at this and they like schedule time every day to write, and some who are just like, whenever it happens, it happens. What's your
hmm
practice like?
I don't know. I'm a little burnt out right now, so right now it looks a little bit different. But I would say like, yeah, it's like okay, on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, I have a quota that I try to fill on those days. Right now it would be coloring 2 pages a day of something of like the current book I'm working on. Um, Tuesdays, Thursdays, I have like a checklist. I have like a to-do list on my notes app that I do like, okay, well, Tuesday, do this. Also, you have an appointment at 1 o'clock. You have a call at 3. Go to the gym at 5. And I think now it's like, okay, well, hopefully you're done by like 9 or 10, and then you can like chill out for an hour or two and then go to bed. Because I don't know, I've never had trouble with time management.
Hmm.
Um, I'm usually pretty ahead of schedule, if not like on time, which is like kind of how it's reflected on like how I show up for like my friends or like to appointments. Like I usually try to get there pretty early or to the airport early. So I've never had a problem with like I just like I just have a checklist for the day that I try to accomplish.
Mm.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Um, Through the process of, you mentioned that this was 500 pages, you had to cut it down, that there were, maybe more anger in it before. Were there any other sort of storytelling breakthroughs that as you told it, you sort of reevaluated how either you saw your life differently in the past, or how you sort of or did you any sort of parts of the story that you retold after sort of looking back on them? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really helped that my editor is actually like an Asian mom.
Mm.
So to have her be with like kind of work on this progress process with me, I was able to get a lot of her point of view of like, okay, well, I'm a mom, like let's like here's like a perspective that I think your mom would have. Like so she was really helpful in that because my mom is pretty closed off from like emotion. Like she doesn't really reveal a lot about what she's feeling
Hmm.
if she does at all. Um so having like Connie, who's my editor, work with me on that was really helpful because I feel like I have no idea what it's like. I have no idea what it's like to be an Asian mom. so having her like there to like kind of throw in her sense of like her side of the story was really helpful. Also, she like grew up in Alabama, which is funny.
Mm.
So yeah.
And then I wanted to ask about the visual style as well. First off, starting with what medium do you use? Is it all digital?
It's all Procreate, yeah.
Okay.
I only use the default brushes.
Hmm. I was gonna ask
Mhm.
because like I feel like it's technically black and white, but there's like a soft blueness to it that
Yeah,
it works
yeah,
so well. And
it's
I'm curious. I just wanted to ask you what like how long it took you to develop that particular style because I feel like it served the story so well.
really okay, that's good because I kind of just winged it. I mean, it was also for a way for me to get away with not using color.
Mm,
I also was really inspired by like Brian Selznick and Sean Tan's work to like they're very like I mean they use real pencil. Like I'm just using fake pencils. So I was like I wanted to kind of emulate that style a little bit more, but like mix it with like lines for characters because I wanted to make it feel like an animation, like an
mm,
animated film. You know how the backgrounds are always like very painterly, but like those animations are usually like cell shaded. So I wanted to go with that aesthetic. But I don't that was like kind of my aesthetic for comics for like a second. And then I realized like this isn't really what I want. Like this
mm.
isn't I don't think I'll be using this style again actually. Just for this specific case. But I don't know how I like came to land to that style in particular. I think I know I drew everything in like pure black, like using like black pencil color to draw it like when I was pitching the project. But actually it came out to look pretty noir. And I was also thinking about like This One Summer by Mariko and Jillian Tamaki, which uses like I'm pretty sure like Jillian used like black ink, but like had it colored in Photoshop, so it has like a more atmospheric color. Um, which actually worked out in our favor because it just feels like a softer atmosphere if instead of using like hex code 0000000.
Sure.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, so let's talk about the business side of things a bit as well, because as fun as the creative process is, you still have to sell the book, you still have to go through the editorial process and all that stuff. So you
Mhm.
mentioned that you got an agent fairly early on in the process. Can you take us through a bit of sort of the back and forth, like whenever you linked up with your agent, sort of, and this story took root, what were some of the first steps you made in getting the story out to market?
Yeah, so I think each agent works differently, but depending on who your person is, they have like a certain set of guidelines of like, okay, well, here's how we would model our graphic novel pitch packet. And mine it was like it was a Word doc. I don't think people use I think that was a little unusual at like in retrospect, but for graphic novels, because you want to make it as visually appealing as possible. But
Mhm.
yeah, mine consisted of like, here I am, here's a synopsis, here are titles that I'm inspired by, here's my bio, um, and here are 15 sample pages of what I want the book to look like, hopefully.
Mhm.
Um, and obviously the aesthetic changes as time goes on because my pitch pages looked very noir, like a murder mystery. And I was like, I don't know if this will work in for all the scenes because I was drawing a nighttime scene when I was pitching it. So I was like, I don't know if this is gonna work for like a daytime scene or a classroom scene. So yeah, I kind of changed it to a bit of a lighter color to work with.
Mhm.
But yeah, it just depends. He just gave me like Ed, my agent, just gave me like, okay, here's what I need from you. I'm like, cool. And then he compiles it together and he's like, here's all the editors that I think would be into this. Cool. I'm like, all right, great. And he sends it out himself.
Mhm.
And I just like kind of like twiddle my thumbs for a second. And I'm like pretend to do work at work, at my fake job.
Was there any editorial feedback from your agent, or was it all he took your stuff, sent it off, and then the editor came in with that?
I don't remember any editorial changes from him. I think he just like helped me with grammar.
Hmm.
I think he trusted me, which is I feel like as um as an agent that's very freeing because
Hmm.
same with my editor. She was very like, yeah, she's just very do what you want. And then if she is like this needs to change, she'll advised that I change it, and she did that for like a few years while, because we were editing the book for a year, because we really wanted to make sure the thumbnails, like we were just like editing thumbnails for a year, and then after that, that's when I started drawing the final art, and I actually changed a lot of things on my own without telling her, but I think that was for the best. I think I figured out, like, I really, really thought about like, well, how do I want this book to flow? And I would let her know every now and then. She'd be like, cool, okay. And then, but yeah, that's why I didn't have to like change a lot of the art, because I knew exactly what I want the book to accomplish. And I think like um, I think she trusted me with the art enough that she didn't really have to like ask for a lot of changes. Like maybe there was like one panel I like erased.
Mm.
That was it.
What was you said your agent showed you a list of all the editors he was going to send it to. What was the response like? Were there multiple takers, or was it always going to be
Yeah.
for a second?
It was I mean, I knew that my top choice would be like Connie, because I know she's worked with Tilly Walden, like
Mhm.
for Spinning, On a Sunbeam, Are You Listening? Um, so Connie is Tilly's editor for First Second, I think
Mhm.
usually. Um, and yeah, so, and like, I mean, Spinning was one of the first like memoirs I read where I was like, oh, okay, this is what a memoir is. I see, I see. And yeah, but Connie was the one who responded in like 30 minutes. So I was like, oh, so she really wanted this. And then after the fact, like, I think we had like, I think maybe like out of the list, maybe like two actively said no, because it was like, oh, like this is not the house for this, or oh, we're already working on a book that's like very similar. I don't know what that means. Um, but yeah, most people were like, yeah, we're in. Like, so that's really nice. And then First Second came up with like the preempt
Mhm.
of, oh yeah, no, we will not only take this book for like this much amount of money, but like we will um buy two more unannounced books from you.
Wow.
So that was like, okay, like obviously if I want a career in publishing, like that's the one I take.
Hmm. Yeah,
And it was like my top choice editor, so
right. That kind of eliminates the decision-making process whenever
right.
number one
Yeah.
comes back and says yes. You're like, okay, well, we're set now.
Yeah. Oh yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
was that so? We First Second is awesome. We've had several people that have gone through First Second and one of their editors on as well, because it feels like their quality is just so high in this space. And I'm
Hmm.
curious, when was that something you communicated to your agent, like, hey, in an ideal world, this is who I would want to do it, or did he already sort of just know that that was the place to go?
I think he kind of knew. Um, I mean, he was like singing high praises to all the editors
Hmm.
on the thing, on the list, but I was like, okay, but like Connie's works with Tilly, and that says a lot to me. Um, I mean, there was one instance where like, um, I think it was like he like sent it to like, I forget the imprint or the publishing house, but they actually like the executive editor, or like the president or something, like actually called my agent and was like, yo, like this is like insane. Like this is like a really, really lovely story, and like we would love to take this, but like we understand if there are like, I think it was like it really affected people from the first get-go.
Mm.
So that was like, that told me that people are going to be into this. But I was worried a lot that like no one was going to be into this. And I think even Connie was like scared too, because she noticed that I was kind of an angry. I had like some things I was still getting over, and she even admitted at some point, she's like, I don't know if you're ready for this, like during the middle of working on it. I was like, oh fuck. And then I realized like, okay, I need to stop being angry, and I need to like get over my trauma in like a healthy way. And then I think that was one of the turning points of, you know, making it like less of a call out post and more of like, oh, this is my fault,
Mm.
sort of. And Connie was one of the people who kind of like helped me out, because we really struggled with like the bit where like I tried to like unalive myself,
Mm.
for, at that point, it was like a second time, and she was like, okay, well, why did you do that? And I was like, I don't know. So we were like talking about that. So Connie was like kind of like a therapist that she didn't really sign up to be. she's like, I'm not getting paid enough. And she didn't say this, but she's like, probably was like, I don't think I'm getting paid enough for this. Yeah.
So I was going to ask about the editorial process, especially, throughout the development of the story. This sold on pitch, so the book wasn't done yet. So there was still a lot of development to go. Was there a lot of back and forth, or you said they mostly trusted you to sort of do the story?
I think there was a point where like, they're like, okay, like the story seems good.
Mm.
You can draw the pages now. I'm like, all right, great. And then at that point, they trusted me to just like handle the art on my own, which is nice because I know that there are some artists who's like, they get so much feedback about like little details on the drawings. And I'm like, I thankfully don't have to do that. They seem to trust me, which is
Mhm.
nice. Like, I'm glad they like my drawings enough. They're like, yeah, no, like they can do it on their own. It's fine. It's fine. So thankful for that.
I don't often like to ask questions like, how does this feel? But I want to ask how it felt to sort of this being the first book you'd done, to have all of this like support and external validation. Like, how did it feel to sort of get that? Was it validating to you as an artist, or were you already pretty set and knowledgeable of how talented you were?
Oh, I mean, I don't know. I think I give myself like, I think I do give myself a hard time of like, yeah, you can do this, but like, look at other people who can do this. Like, I'm always
Mm.
like comparing myself, which is another thing. I'm talking to my therapist in roughly an hour. And but like sometimes I put all my work together, and I did that for like a lecture I did. Like I don't really see all my work at once. Like I usually see like maybe like one or two at a time, like from my side. But when I see them all at once, it's like, oh, like these are good. Like they look good. But I always look at them and say, I'm my harshest critic, right? I look at my stuff and I feel like there's a lot that I can improve on, which I mean, like the sketchbook that I'm working on right now, it's just like it's just me like struggling to improve. Like I'm just practicing and practicing and practicing because I came to realize that there's a lot of stuff in my work that I feel like I'm not comfortable doing. And I'm spending, I think like almost every night, like maybe spending like maybe 10 or 15 minutes understanding the thing that I don't really understand. Um, I think a lot of it has to do with, I mean, illustration as a general practice, like you don't have to be good at drawing to be a good illustrator. But I feel like I land in the camp of like, oh, like I would like to work in animation one day. Maybe I would like to work on a project one day. Um, but you have to be good at drawing to be in the animation industry. Like you have to be good. You have to understand anatomy. You have to understand, and like that's the stuff that really like I love inhaling. Like I want to be good at the technical stuff, and that's a lot of things that I feel like I struggle in still. Um, but yeah, I mean, again, illustrate. The reason I went into illustration in the first place was that I came to realize that illustration is like the only thing that I feel like I have an endless drive of like I have to get better. I have to get better. And there were a lot of like, for example, UX design. I never felt that. Like there was a point where it's like, okay, like I'm done. I like I can be content with this, but I'm never content with what I have right now. Like I know that this could be better, and I know I can be better, and like how can I possibly get better? Like how in a way of like what are ways that I can get better than this? Like I'm always trying to find a direction. With other things, with like violin, with um even like with violin, even with like lifting weights or UX design, I'm like, like this is good enough for me. I never feel like my drawings are good enough, which is a problem.
But I think it's also
Yeah.
such a good barometer for people that aren't sure which route to go, of knowing like the one that you want to keep getting better at is probably the one that means the most. I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that's another that my brother, I think, got a hard time with that when after I left college because, after I left, um, my brother started getting all the shit of like, oh, well, what are you passionate about? Like, what do you want to keep learning? And my brother's just a regular guy. Like he's interested in some things, but like he's not like I think like when you compare him with me, like I am obsessive about like getting good at something, at getting it good at drawing, but he's just like a guy. He's just a normal person who just like, yeah, like I mean, I'll do CS, but like I'm not gonna like devote all my time to about reading about CS.
Mhm.
And I think he got a lot of shit for that because it's like, oh well, maybe you're not as passionate as Deb, so
Mhm.
therefore you're not doing enough. Um, I don't know. He likes games.
Hey, that's a good passion to have.
It's a good passion to have. I mean, not my parents, not good with my parents, but like, but I think they would argue like, oh, if you're really that into games, you would read about games. You would
Mhm.
read like you would watch movies about games. You would do research about games. My brother likes consuming them. As far as I'm concerned, or as far as they are concerned, it's like, oh, you just like consuming. You don't really like to produce anything.
Mhm. So we're just about out of time. So I
Oh
want to get
yes.
two last questions in. First off, what's next? What do you have coming up? Anything you can share, that is.
Yeah, like I'm going to San Diego Comic-Con tomorrow. I've never been to a single Comic-Con, as I told you earlier before we started recording. And I'm working on another graphic novel that I've actually been working on since 2019. So once again, 5-year track record coming out next year. So it's written by an author named Tina Cho, and I'm illustrating it. But it's called The Other Side of Tomorrow from Harper Alley, and it is about escaping North Korea,
Mm.
which is going to be interesting because there are no books about escaping North Korea in the graphic novel world. So I'm interested to see how people react to
Mm.
this. Yeah,
It's an exciting time to be in the young reader graphic novel space because there's
it
a lot of
is.
cool stuff.
It's also my first time working in full color in a book setting,
Mhm.
so it's a lot. It looks more similar to the kind of work that I do for like normal regular clients who are not publishing. So
Mhm.
it's a lot.
So segueing that into last but not least,
Mm-hmm.
anything you want to promote other than what you just did? Where can people find you online, on social media, all that good stuff?
Yeah, so I have like wherever I have like an account of like people where I put content in, I go, my username is JDEBBIEL, and I do not like to go by the name Debbie in the slightest, but that was the only name that was available in Tumblr in 2012, and I've just like stuck with it. I'm like, well, I guess I'm stuck here now. But yeah, I think I say like JDebiel, but some people say like J Debiel. I'm like, okay, like if you want, I guess. Yeah, it was the only thing left on Tumblr that I could claim that was close to my name at all. So yeah,
Awesome. Well, Deb, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Have a wonderful time at San Diego Comic-Con.
thank you. And if you're going to New York Comic Con,
I
right?
am. Yeah,
Okay, cool. I'm tabling, so like come by and say hello.
100%. I'll be there.
Oh yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Josh.
Absolutely. Yeah. To all our listeners, the recording will be up in a week and we'll be back in 2 weeks. So we'll see you then.
Bye.
Bye.